So this morning we're finishing up a sermon series that we have been calling Come and See. And we've chosen to kick it off every week with this video because I personally think there's something about this video that kind of gets at the heart of what we're trying to say. We have all had experiences in life that are just so good, that touch us in such profound ways that we want others to know about it. And just, sending a note is not going to do it, right? Sometimes you experience something and you just want to run out and grab the people you care most about and say, you got to come and see this for yourself. And as we've seen each week, it turns out that has been people's natural response to having an encounter with Jesus Christ from the very beginning. All throughout the biographies of Jesus that we have in the New Testament that we call the Gospels, time and time again, you see that people encounter Jesus, and something about the interaction they have with him just pushes them to go out and grab their friends, their neighbors, and say, you've got to come and see this man for yourself. And to finish up this series, I want us to turn together in our Bibles to John chapter 11. Use whatever kind of a physical Bible, electronic Bible, whatever you brought with you. If you didn't bring a Bible with you this morning, or maybe you're kind of new to the faith and you're not really sure how to find specific passages in the Bible, it's totally okay. If that's you, on one of the seats around you, you can grab a Bible and you can just turn to the page number that's listed up on the screen so that we'll all be on the same page together. But as you're turning there, I want to take a minute and just get something off my chest. For the first time in a decade, my wife and I find ourselves in an interesting position. We are no longer homeowners. We're renting a house right now as we're trying to figure out, where are we going to make our permanent home here in Corvallis. By the way, let me just say the housing market here in Corvallis is a real treat. But no, it's just been interesting to be renting for the first time in, 10 years because there are a lot of things that I miss about being a homeowner. But there's one thing that I've discovered I really don't miss, and that is home repair and maintenance. We moved into the rental house and one of the toilets was running, so my first thought was well, I guess I need to go to Home Depot and it's probably this. And then I thought, no, this is somebody else's problem now. So I could just call them and say, hey, and the guy showed up and he fixed it. I'm like, this is awesome. Because that was not always the experience I had with home repairs. For about 10 years when we were living in Tulsa, I engaged in sort of a running battle with a crack that popped up over the drywall by the front door. It's one of these things, like in the summer, it would pop open, so I would spackle it and I'd paint over it and it'd be good, but then in the winter, it would pop open again and you spackle and you repaint it. And it just never ended. The fight never ended. The house that we lived in was 40 years old. It was on some soil that was kind of not super stable, and a lot of houses in our neighborhood had had foundation repair work done over the years, as had ours. So anyway, I'm in the never-ending fight with the drywall crack, and one day we have a structural engineer out doing some work for us, and I kind of point out the crack to him, and in typical Oklahoma fashion, he looks at it and he's like, yep, that's a problem. It's like, well, thanks, I'm glad I'm paying you to tell me that. He said, but you're never going to fix that, right? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, that crack in a drywall is a problem. But what you don't understand is you got a problem behind the problem. I was like, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, your foundation's just not as stable as it once was. So every year the temperature shifts, the soil moves, that thing is just always going to keep popping up. He says, you will never fix that problem until you address the problem behind the problem. Right? You're always going to be patching this stuff up on the surface until you deal with the foundational issues. And that really got me thinking. Because it got me thinking, well, how often do we do that? I mean, have you guys ever had an experience like that? I mean, when you've got a problem and you just work and work and work, and no matter what you do, the problem just keeps popping its ugly head back up. When it's something like a crack in your drywall, it's really not that big of a deal. But what about the times when we make that mistake with things that really matter? What about the problems that we have in more significant areas of our lives that keep coming up because we're dealing with them on the surface and we just don't address the root cause of the problem? I mean, when we do that, that's when we're really in some dangerous waters. And that's why I'm excited to share with you all today, because what we're talking about today, I think, can genuinely be helpful to all of us. Whether you are here this morning and you would consider yourself a follower of Jesus Christ or not, I think the passage that we're going to talk about today gives some really practical guidance on how to deal with problems in our lives. Right? So if you're here and you're just exploring the faith for yourself, and you're not sure what you believe about Jesus, the Bible, Christians, any of that stuff, I just want you to know I'm really glad you're here because I think you've picked a great day to come. What we're going to talk about, I think, can be really genuinely helpful to you in lots and lots of ways. But to see that, we're going to jump into this story in John 11. But to get there, I want to give you just a little bit of background so that when we hit the ground, we'll be able to hit the ground running. So this story takes place near the very end of Jesus' life and ministry here on earth. So he's been preaching and teaching for several years. And really, from the very beginning, there was this tension between Jesus and between the religious leaders of the day. And over the years, that tension hasn't gotten any better. In fact, it's built and it's gotten worse, and there's all sorts of animosity there. And now things have really come to a boiling point. Because now the religious leaders in Jerusalem, the authorities, are starting to hear a rumor. They're starting to hear a report that Jesus has brought a dead man back to life. Now, in case you're wondering about this is not like the movie The Princess Bride, okay? You guys remember the movie The Princess Bride, any of you? Okay. This is just free from Jesus' heart to yours pastoral advice. If you have never seen the movie The Princess Bride, Jesus wants you to watch this today, okay? It is a great movie. Your kids will love it. Your grandkids will love it if you haven't seen it. But in this movie, there's a character named Wesley, and something happens, and everybody else thinks that Wesley is dead. But it turns out that he's not dead. He's just mostly dead. And mostly dead is still slightly alive. That is not what is going on in this story with Jesus. Lazarus, the man who is dead, is not mostly dead. He is dead, dead, dead. In fact, the author of the Gospel of John goes out of his way to say he's not just dead, he is really dead. In fact, there's this great moment where Jesus is coming onto the scene, and he says, well, let's go pull the stone back. Let's see Lazarus. And they're like, whoa, Jesus. I don't know if you realize this, but he's been dead for 3 days. And in one of the most beautiful uses of the English language ever, in the old King James Version, it says, Lord, he stinketh, right? He is not mostly dead. He is all the way dead. There is no coming back for Lazarus. So that's the situation that Jesus finds himself in. But Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha, they were dear, dear friends of Jesus. So Jesus shows up to sort of be with the grieving sisters. And they're saying, God, Lord, if you had been here, maybe you could have done something. You know, you've healed people before. Maybe you could have healed our brother. I bet if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. He says, well, Mary and Martha, where is Lazarus? They say, come and see, Lord. Come and see where we have laid him. I mean, there's that line we've been talking about, come and see. But in this instance, it's sort of the script is flipped. Because Mary and Martha, look, they've got this really significant problem in their life. And they think, well, Jesus is a friend and he's powerful and he's a teacher. Maybe he can do something about it. God, why don't you come and see what's going on with me and see what we can do about that? So Jesus comes with them. And he comes to the tomb, and they open it up. And then, as John tells us, Jesus, in what is his greatest miracle to date, he brings this all-the-way dead man back to life. Now, if you are here today, and you think about the story of Jesus bringing a dead man back to life, and you've got some doubts and questions about that, I just want you to know I understand that. So for those of us who have made a commitment to follow Jesus Christ, we really believe he is who he says he is. We believe it is totally within his power to bring a dead person back to life. But if you're not convinced that Jesus is who he says he is, if you're just checking out Christianity, if you're exploring his claims for yourself, and you have doubts and questions about this, that is a totally reasonable position to hold. I mean, how often in the course of our normal lives do we see dead people come back to life? Never, right? So if you're not convinced that Jesus really is who he says he is, I think it's okay for you to have doubts and questions about this. But what I would encourage you to do is just to continue to bring those questions with you, right? There is always a place for your questions here. If God's not a big enough God to help you answer your questions, he's not a God worth following in the first place. So having doubts and questions are okay. Exploring those things are okay. There's always a space to do that here. But whatever you believe about whether or not Jesus actually did this, and whatever I believe about this, and I believe he did it, like that's we can set that aside for the moment. Because what is important for the sake of this story is that the people who saw it believed it happened. The crowds believed Jesus had done this, and the religious leaders believed that he had done this, or they certainly believed that the crowds thought he had done it. So that's what's going on in the background. So I want us to jump in verse 45, and we'll see how this takes off. So it says, therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary, that's Lazarus' sister, they'd come to mourn and grieve with her, and they had seen what Jesus did, that he brought this man back to life. They put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. Okay, so the word is out that Jesus has done this, and the Jewish leaders aren't quite sure how to respond. So they gather this meeting together of the Sanhedrin, which is kind of the top Jewish governing body of the day. You know, the Roman army ruled the land, but the Sanhedrin they organize things for the Romans in their place. So they get together and they have a meeting, and what a meeting it is, right? You keep going, and look what they say in this meeting. They say, "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here's this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation." Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. And he says, "You know nothing at all. You don't realize that it's better for you that one man die than that the whole nation perish." Right, so the leaders see what's going on. They see that the people are beginning to see Jesus as this incredible leader. Maybe there's something more to him than just a man. And that worries them. Because in their head, they're jumping forward a few steps, and they're like, okay, well, how's this going to play out? If crowds of people rush to Jesus, if they begin thinking, maybe there's something special about this guy, maybe he can help us in a new and powerful way, well, the Romans are going to see that as a real threat to their power. They're going to see that as the beginning of a rebellion. So if the crowds think that Jesus can do this, and they rally to that man's side, the Roman will see it, they will bring the army in, they will drop the hammer, and people will die. So that's the fear that's driving these Jewish leaders as they're having this conversation. And if you skip forward a few verses, you see that their fears really do start to come true. The Passover is getting ready to happen, which is this major Jewish religious festival. So people have flooded into Jerusalem from different countries in the countryside. The population's like 2 or 3 times what the city normally would be. And then the word gets out to the crowd that Jesus is coming into the city. So if you look at verse 12 of chapter 12, you see how they welcome him. It says, "The next day, the great crowd that had come for the feast heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. So they took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, 'Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel.'" Right? The people hear that Jesus is coming, and they rally, and they cut down these big palm branches, and they start waving them, which to us might not mean much, but that was a bad sign for the Jewish leaders. Because back in that day, you would only welcome someone into your city waving palm branches in 2 cases. You would do it if that person was a king and they were coming to visit. Or you would do that for a hero, right? A conquering military general who had won a great victory. That's how you would welcome him back to town. And I think the crowd is hoping that Jesus might just be both of those things. He might be the king. He might be the one who can rally the troops and drive the Romans out. So you keep reading, it says, "Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they heard that Jesus had done this, that he'd raised this man, that he'd given this miraculous sign, they go out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, 'This is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him.' So they see what's going on with the palm branches, and they know what that means, and they panic, and they give the word, and they call out the guards, and they arrest Jesus, and 5 days later, he's dead." Now keep that whole timeline in mind, and I want us to go back for just a second to where we started, with the idea of the problem behind the problem, right? The crack in the drywall. Now I think if you were to go and sit down with any first century Jewish person living in Israel and said, "Hey, what is the biggest problem that you face in life?" They would all say the same thing. It's the Romans. It's the Roman army. Right? And there's something to that. That's a real problem for the people of Israel, because God had promised that he was going to bless the people of Israel, bless their land. But every day they wake up and they see that the Roman army is still out there, and they think, well, this is really getting in the way of what God promised to do and the way that he chose to bless us. They would say, I think the Romans, they're the biggest problem we've got. But I think even though the leaders and the people would say that the Romans were the biggest problem, I think if they answered that, they would be wrong. They would be missing the point. And that's part of what Scripture is trying to show us here. Because the biggest problem that they had was not the Romans. Right? The Romans are just the crack in the drywall that show that there's something going on at a deeper, more foundational level that has to be dealt with. No, the real problem that the people had is that they had been separated from God because of their sin. You see, all throughout the Old Testament, the prophets, they would talk and they would say, look, there is a clear way that God has called you as people, as families, as a nation to live. And when you live that way, God's blessing will be on you. But if you choose to go a different way, if you choose to turn your back on him and follow the rules that you come up with for yourself, then God, I will allow foreign armies to come into your land as a way to remind you that it is time to come back. See, the Romans were a problem, but they weren't the problem behind the problem. The problem behind the problem was that brokenness inside the people of Israel that drove them to make these destructive decisions with their life, the brokenness that Scripture calls sin. And now, I don't know about you all, but I see way more of myself in this story than I want to. I'm kind of an expert when it comes to missing the problem behind the problem. And not just with the drywall. I mean, I'm so good at this, I can do this with absolutely every area of my life. But here's the thing, and this is something that I really think can be helpful to all of us, whether you would consider yourself a Christian or not. I think if we really want to find honest, lasting solutions to the biggest problems and challenges we face, we have to do the extra work of stopping and asking ourselves, okay, could it be that there's a problem behind the problem? Could it be that there is more going on here than what I see on the surface? So what I want to do for just a minute is invite you guys to sort of take this idea for a test drive. Okay, so I want all of you to just stop and think about your own life. Think about the biggest challenge that you're facing, or a significant problem that you have. If you look and you think, boy, here's an area where things are just not going well, just really take a minute and stop and identify what you would say that is for you, for your own personal life. You probably don't need this much time. Most of us can think of our problems pretty quickly, can't we? But now here's what I want you to do. I want you to just stop and ask yourself, okay, could it be that there is a problem behind the problem? Right? Could it be that there's an issue going on that is a deeper, more foundational issue that is really at the root of what I've identified as the biggest problem in my life? Now, just to be clear, sometimes there's not, right? Sometimes there's not a deep, dark, secret problem behind the problem. Sometimes bad things just happen to us. Right? Sometimes you lose your job. Sometimes you watch as parents or people that you love deal with cancer. I mean, sometimes there is no problem behind the problem. But I think for most of us, most of the time, if we're being honest with ourselves, we realize that a lot of the times there is a problem behind the problem. And if we're really being honest with ourselves, we have to say the problem behind the problem is us. I mean, just a question we've got to wrestle with, right? What if what was true for the people of Israel back then is also true for us as well? You know, what if we can't solve our problems in a thoroughgoing way because of the deep brokenness inside of all of us? Right? What if it's something about the ways that our own fears and our insecurities drive the decisions we make and the words we say and the actions that we take? I mean, all of us, when we think about our own lives, we can identify ways where we've had difficulties and then we realize that they've gotten worse, and we realize they've gotten worse because of the things that we have done, the ways that we have said or done things that have contributed to the problem. So if you're willing to do that, right, if you're willing to open yourself up to the possibility that maybe there's a problem behind the problem and maybe at least part of that is me, then how does that change the way you deal with the problem that you yourself identified this morning, right? You think about what you identified as the biggest problem you're facing in life. Well, if there's a possibility that there's a problem behind the problem and you're a part of that problem, how does that change the approach that you take in dealing with that? I mean, maybe for you, you thought, okay, biggest problem in my life right now, it's a money problem, right? I don't have enough of it, I'm in debt up to my eyeballs. Well, maybe when you think about it, that's not really a money problem. I mean, maybe you're in debt up to your eyeballs because you don't have enough self-control to spend less than what you earn. Or maybe you're driven to buy things that you can't afford because you want people to see what you have. There's something about the way that having more and accomplishing more that builds you up in the eyes of other people and that drives you to buy things you can't afford. I mean, if that's you, if that's me, we've just got to be honest. That's not a money problem. That's a heart problem. That's a sinful, broken us problem. Or maybe it's a relationship. Maybe when you thought about the biggest challenge you're facing right now, what came to mind was some kind of relationship issue you're in, right? You're not getting along with your parents. Your marriage is going through a hard time. There's a friendship that's not what you want it to be. I mean, one of the things that I think we've got to stop and admit is, okay, are there things that I'm doing? Maybe it's not 100% the other person's fault. Maybe it's the sinful, broken stuff in me that makes me say the thing or do the thing that really just goads the sinful, broken part of them to responding and saying and doing the thing that just snowballs things and it just makes it worse. I mean, really, we've just got to ask ourselves, could it be that there's something inside of us that is actually preventing us from finding the long-term solution to the problem that we want to find? I mean, this idea of the problem and the problem behind the problem. I was talking to a friend not too long ago about a divorce that she was going through. It was just incredibly painful, right? Divorce always is. And it's interesting, it was painful in a lot of levels, right? Up here, there's the situation. There's the divorce itself. There's the pain it caused. There's all the questions about taxes and things like that you got to deal with. And she said, one of the things that's been really helpful for me is I've been seeing a counselor to kind of talk about this kind of stuff. And Mike, it has really helped me on two different levels. And I didn't think about it in those terms before, but it's really helped on the surface, right? To have some professional guidance on how do you set boundaries? How do you talk to this person? How do you deal with this? How do you work through the grief and the pain? But she said, what's been incredibly helpful is that this counselor is also helping me think, what do I do to deal with the problem that's deeper down? She's helping me really wrestle with some questions like, why did I choose to marry someone who is an active alcoholic when I knew he was an alcoholic? When I knew that his beliefs and his life just didn't line up with mine? Why did I marry somebody when I knew that we were like oil and water and this was never going to work out? What needs to be addressed in me that pushed me to help make that decision? So for her, she just said, the counseling has been very helpful because it's dealt with this on both issues. There is the problem on the surface you got to deal with. But sometimes we've got to dig a little bit deeper and say, is there a problem behind the problem? And if so, what do we do about that? And I know that this is just very true for my life. I mean, I can't speak for all of you, but I've had my fair share of problems in life. And sometimes there are things that people have just kind of dumped on me. But more often than I would want to admit, the root cause of my problem is me. It's my selfishness. It's my greed. It's my kind of broken ways and warped ways of interacting with other people. All too often when I try to dig into this and I realize there is a problem behind the problem, and he looks a lot like this guy. And here's the thing. I think Jesus knew that. When he entered Jerusalem that day, he knew that the fundamental problem that people had was not the Romans, right? The fundamental problem that people had is that there was this separation between God and them. There was this distance between the lives that God created them to live and the choices that they were making because the sinful brokenness inside of them. And God knew, and Jesus knew that the only way to bridge that gap was somehow going to happen through his death on the cross and his resurrection. And he entered into Jerusalem that day knowing full well where that was going to lead. And the most amazing thing about that is that you see in Paul's letter to the Romans, he says this. He said that Jesus was willing to do this for us while we were still sinners. Right? He didn't say you got to get your act together first. You got to deal with what's going on in your own life first. No, in this great demonstration of his love and the love that God has for each and every one of us, he was willing to step into the brokenness of our world, our lives, and our relationships right then. And that's the beautiful thing about the gospel. I mean, that is the gospel message as simply as I know how to put it. We are all more broken than we can ever know, but we are also all more loved than we can ever imagine. You and me, all of us, we are more broken than we can ever know, but we are more loved than we can ever imagine. Now, that's the kind of help that people needed back then. And that's the kind of help that we still need today. So if you're here this morning and you would already consider yourself a follower of Jesus Christ, may this day just be a reminder to you that we have to stay connected to him. We have to stay connected to the love and the grace and the power that he offers us if we want to do this continuing, ongoing work of dealing with what's left over of that brokenness inside of us so that we can relate to others, to God in healthier and more productive ways. Remember that the strength to face these problems well is only found in our connection to him. If you're here this morning and you have never come to the place where you've put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, if you would like to talk about that, we would consider it a real privilege to do that with you. But if you're not there yet, I want to encourage you to do something really simple. I want you to keep coming back. Maybe it's coming back in your own life to the practice of just reading the Bible for yourself. Maybe it's coming back to church to sort of hear more about the teachings and example of Jesus for yourself, because Jesus is an incredible person. Right? Jesus is the only person I know of who can help us deal with all of life's challenges on two different levels. Right? We have challenges on the surface, and Jesus' teaching and his example of life and things about money and relationships, it is incredible. If we follow his teachings, we really do get better at life. But Jesus also, we believe, has this amazing ability to deal with not just what's on the surface, but to deal with that problem behind the problem. The brokenness inside of us that we cannot get rid of on our own. So wherever you are in life and in your journey with God, your understanding of him, we just would encourage you to come back. In fact, I want you to know next week we're starting a new sermon series that we're calling Relatable. And it's really all about how do you take the teachings of Jesus and actually put them into practice in your life, in the relationships that you have with other people, so that those relationships can thrive and be all that they can be. Now, just out of curiosity, how many of you guys are in a relationship with someone? Just anyone? You guys realize all of you should have your hands up right now. I'm just saying. So if you are in a relationship with any other person on the face of this earth, I think what we're going to talk about in the next 4 weeks can actually be helpful to you, so I would encourage you to come back. And that's really, we're going to sing a last song together in just a minute after we pray. But that's what I hope you take away from this series, that the invitation that Jesus gave at the beginning was to come and see. The invitation that he still gives now is to come and see. The invitation that we as a local church will never stop giving you is to come and see more about who Jesus is and the difference he can make in your life. So with that in mind, would you pray with me? Father, thank you for the opportunity that we have had to be here together today. I'm just very grateful, Lord, that you can make a difference in our life on both levels, that your teaching, your example for things like money, relationships, all those things, it really does help us live the best, healthiest, most productive kind of life. And that's something that all of us want, God. But I just pray, Lord, as we go through this week, that you would just keep our eyes and our heart open to the ways that maybe the challenges that we face aren't just what we see on the surface. Help us know, Lord, if there's something at a deeper level that needs to be addressed. And we just leave it up to you, God, in your wisdom and your power to speak to each one of us, to know what it looks like to address those issues in ways that can bring helpful and lasting change, so that we can live the lives that we were created to live, so that we can be fully alive in you. Amen.